So here's what just set Washington on fire tonight. Trump's private jet has been hit with an FAA grounding order, and the timing is so brutal it feels engineered. The guy who spent months flying from rally to rally projecting this image of untouchable power just got yanked back to earth by the one agency that doesn't care about slogans, crowds, or Truth Social posts. And the wild part is, the people around him aren't treating this like a routine compliance issue. They're treating it like a crisis, because it's happening right in the middle of his campaign travel machine, when every hour and every stop is supposed to feed momentum. Trump's Boeing 757 has always been more than transportation. It's a moving billboard, a stage prop, a symbol. Since he re-entered campaign mode, that aircraft has been part of the message. Big crowds, big claims, big wealth, big certainty. The jet lands, cameras roll, and the story writes itself. Trump descends the stairs like he owns the sky. The aircraft has been the visual shorthand for his entire brand. He's different, he's rich, he's in control. But now the control is gone, and the people closest to him know what that means. Because when you ground the plane, you don't just delay a flight. You disrupt the image. You scramble the schedule. You turn the campaign into improvisation. And according to people familiar with the standoff, this didn't happen overnight. The tension has reportedly been building for weeks, with inspectors, paperwork, and a growing list of items the FAA wanted addressed before the aircraft could continue normal operations. That's why Trump's team is furious. They can't sell this as a random ambush if the paper trail exists. But they also can't admit the violations were real without taking a direct hit to the whole rules don't apply to me posture. So what do? They do what they always do, turn it into a fight. The public message becomes persecution. The private message becomes panic. Inside the operation, the fallout starts immediately. Rallies that were supposed to happen back-to-back suddenly become logistical nightmares. Donors who expected private meetings get told there's a scheduling change. Staffers begin calling charter companies and looking at smaller aircraft, which sounds harmless until you realize how Trump's base reads visuals. A 757 is dominance. A cramped charter is damage control. A commercial terminal is humiliation. And for a campaign built on strength, humiliation is poison. What makes this even more combustible is the accusation, coming straight from Trump's side, that the FAA is acting like an extension of political power. He frames the grounding as a deep state tactic, an attempt to slow him down when he's gaining steam. He posts about it. He rages about it. He says the timing proves everything. But there's a problem with that argument. Aviation safety is one of the few areas where timing doesn't matter. If an agency believes an aircraft isn't compliant, they don't get to shrug and say, let's wait until after the election. Safety regulations exist because when something goes wrong at altitude, nobody gets a second chance. And here's where the narrative sharpens. Reports circulating in media chatter claim inspectors flagged issues that go beyond cosmetic paperwork. Things like maintenance documentation that didn't align with actual work performed, certifications that weren't current, and alterations that weren't properly signed off in a way regulators consider acceptable. Whether every claim is accurate or not, the key fact is this. Trump's team is treating the FAA like an enemy to be defeated, not a regulator to satisfy. That posture may play well with the most combative corners of his audience, but it is the worst possible approach if you actually want the aircraft cleared quickly, because aviation enforcement doesn't bend to volume, it bends to documentation. Now add one more ingredient, and you get the full political explosion. Warren Buffett's name gets dragged into the chaos, not because Buffett is running the FAA, he isn't, but because he represents something Trump can't easily bully. A reputation built on stability, compliance, and the slow, boring discipline of rules. The story making the rounds is that Trump's orbit floated the idea of using a Berkshire-related private aviation option as a workaround, as if a famous name could pressure the situation, soften the optics, or at least keep the campaign moving without looking weakened. And the moment that idea touched daylight, it created a different kind of problem, because Buffett doesn't play that game. Buffett's brand is not built on adrenaline, it's built on trust. If he even looks like he's helping someone dodge safety requirements, he risks staining an entire business philosophy that depends on doing things the right way, even when it's inconvenient. So instead of staying quiet, the response becomes a statement of principle. No services, no exceptions, no special treatment when safety compliance is in question. And when a figure like Buffett draws a line, it doesn't just irritate Trump's camp, it makes them look smaller. It tells the public, this isn't politics, this is procedure, and that is the last framing Trump wants. So now Trump is trapped between two instincts that don't fit together. One instinct says fight, attack, call it corrupt, never admit error. The other instinct says fix the plane, comply, get back in the air, keep the campaign machine running. But compliance requires acknowledging the FAA has authority. It requires doing the unglamorous work. Paperwork, inspections, sign-offs, corrections, verification. It requires patience, and patience has never been Trump's preferred weapon. That's why his team is sweating, because every day the aircraft sits grounded is another day the story grows legs. Another day donors wonder what else is shaky behind the scenes. Another day opponents get fresh material. Another day his strongman image takes a hit from something as unromantic as a safety checklist. And the worst part? This isn't the kind of fight you can win with a speech. You can't rally your way out of an inspection report. You can't insult your way past a grounded registration. In the air, physics doesn't care who you are. And on the ground, regulators don't care what you post. If this drags on, the consequences aren't just logistical, they're psychological, because the campaign depends on velocity, constant motion, constant headlines, constant dominance. Grounding the jet interrupts that rhythm. It turns Trump from the man who arrives on his own plane into the man who has to explain why he can't. And once a leader is forced to explain, the spell weakens. The real question isn't just whether the jet returns to service. The real question is what the public decides this means, a political hit job, or the simplest story of all, another moment where Trump meets a system that doesn't grant exceptions, even to him. And this is where the situation quietly turns from a headline into a test of power. Not political power, but institutional power. Because for all the noise, the insults, the posts, and the outrage, the FAA has something Trump's world doesn't: process. There are forms that must be completed, inspections that must be redone, findings that must be cleared in writing. No rally can replace a signed compliance document. No donor can override a failed safety check. No viral clip can lift a grounded aircraft. Inside Trump's operation, that reality is sinking in fast. The initial anger has given way to calculation. Lawyers are now involved. Aviation consultants are being brought back in. People who specialize in dealing with regulators, not attacking them, are suddenly very valuable. Because the longer this standoff lasts, the more it stops looking like persecution and starts looking like mismanagement. And mismanagement is a word Trump's critics love, but his base hates to associate with him. There's also another problem emerging beneath the surface: precedent. If Trump forces the FAA to bend, every future enforcement action becomes suspect. Inspectors know this. Administrators know this. That's why backing down isn't just embarrassing for the agency, it's dangerous. Aviation safety only works if the rules are universal and boring. The moment celebrity, money, or politics create carve-outs, the entire system becomes negotiable. And negotiable safety is how disasters happen. That's why the FAA's posture matters far beyond Trump. It's about whether regulators still regulate or whether they merely negotiate with whoever yells the loudest. Meanwhile, the campaign optics continue to deteriorate. Rival candidates don't even have to attack aggressively, they just let the story exist. Every time Trump complains about being grounded, he reinforces the same narrative opponents have been pushing for years. Chaos follows him, conflict follows him, institutions eventually collide with him, and this time it's not courts or committees, it's something as visceral as a plane that won't take off. Even among Republicans, the tone is shifting. Not publicly, at least not yet, but privately. Donors care about reliability, party strategists care about execution, and nothing rattles confidence like operational failure during a campaign that's supposed to project inevitability. A grounded jet may sound trivial compared to indictments or investigations, but campaigns are built on rhythm. Break the rhythm, and momentum leaks out. What makes this episode especially revealing is how small the fix actually is. This isn't a constitutional crisis. It's not a legal labyrinth. It's compliance. Do the work. Fix the issues. Pass inspection. Get back in the air. Any other candidate would quietly do exactly that. But Trump's brand resists quiet solutions. He doesn't win by resolving problems. He wins by turning them into battles. And that instinct, which has fueled him for years, may be the very thing that keeps his plane on the ground longer than necessary. So now everyone is watching the same question play out in real time. Does Trump blink? Does he accept the FAA's authority long enough to get what he needs? Or does he keep fighting, letting the delay itself become proof that no one can tell him what to do, even if it costs him time, optics, and momentum? Because if there's one thing this episode makes clear, it's this: gravity doesn't care about politics, and neither do safety regulators when they believe the rules have been ignored. The jet will fly again only when the paperwork says it can. Until then, Trump can shout, accuse, and threaten all he wants, but the runway stays empty. And in a campaign built on motion, nothing is more dangerous than standing still. What happens next won't be dramatic in the way Trump usually prefers. There will be no single moment where the FAA announces victory or defeat, no televised showdown, no triumphant press conference on a runway. Instead, the outcome will arrive quietly, buried in technical language and procedural updates. Either the aircraft will be cleared after corrections are made, or it won't. And that quiet ending is precisely what strips Trump of control over the narrative. Because while Trump thrives in chaos he can shape, this is chaos he can't steer. Every day the plane remains grounded reinforces the same unspoken conclusion. Systems still exist that don't bend to personality. That realization is uncomfortable not just for Trump, but for the ecosystem around him that has learned to treat rules as suggestions and pressure as a substitute for compliance. Behind closed doors, the campaign now faces a series of trade-offs it never wanted to confront. Do they accelerate repairs and inspections and risk confirming the FAA's concerns were legitimate? Or do they delay, fight, and keep feeding a story that undercuts Trump's central claim that he's uniquely competent and in command? Either path carries damage. One hits the ego, the other hits momentum. There's also a long-term consequence forming beneath the surface: documentation. Once regulators are involved at this level, records don't disappear. Inspection reports get logged, correspondence gets archived, decisions get time-stamped. Even if the plane is eventually cleared, the trail remains, and that trail can resurface later, not as a scandal, but as a reference point. Another example cited when Trump claims unfair treatment and agencies respond with receipts. For voters watching from a distance, the story is already simplifying itself. It's no longer about aviation law or maintenance schedules. It's about a familiar pattern. Trump pushes, institutions push back. He calls it corruption. The system keeps moving. Some people see persecution, others see accountability, and the longer the standoff lasts, the harder it becomes for the middle ground to ignore it. What's striking is how avoidable this moment was. A routine compliance process could have kept the jet flying quietly, unnoticed, uncontroversial. Instead, the refusal to concede even an inch turned a technical issue into a national story. That choice reveals more than any inspection report ever could. It shows how deeply Trump's identity is tied to defiance, even when defiance offers no advantage. And that's the real takeaway here. Not the jet, not the FAA, not even Warren Buffett's refusal to be dragged into the mess. The takeaway is that Trump's greatest strength, his instinct to fight everything, becomes a liability when the opponent isn't political, emotional, or ideological, but procedural. In the end, the jet will either fly or it won't. The campaign will either adapt or stumble, but the lesson will linger. Power that refuses limits eventually runs into systems designed specifically to impose them. And when that happens, there's no speech, no rally, no outrage powerful enough to lift you off the ground. Until the paperwork is signed, the engines stay silent. And in a race defined by speed, silence is a very loud signal. And that silence is beginning to do something Trump's critics could never quite manage on their own. It's creating doubt without argument. There's no prosecutor speaking, no judge issuing a ruling, no opposition at framing the moment. There's just absence, no dramatic arrival shot, no jet on the tarmac, no staircase moment for cameras. And in modern politics, absence speaks louder than accusation. Campaign staff can try to compensate. They can tighten schedules, stack events closer together, lean harder on surrogates. But none of that replaces the visual language Trump has relied on for nearly a decade. His campaigns have always been theatrical, built on dominance cues that signal inevitability. The plane was part of that theater. Take it away, and the production loses scale. It feels smaller, more constrained, more ordinary. And ordinary is the one thing Trump has never sold. What makes this episode linger is that it resists escalation. There is no lever Trump can pull to force resolution on his timeline, no court he can rush, no crowd he can mobilize to pressure a safety inspector. The FAA doesn't respond to outrage, it responds to checklists, and that mismatch between a man who operates through confrontation and a system that operates through procedure keeps grinding. Inside the campaign, this is now less about the jet and more about control. Advisors are quietly asking what happens if similar friction appears elsewhere. If a technical agency can slow him down here, what happens with permits, security clearances, logistics, or compliance issues down the line? The jet becomes symbolic not because it's unique, but because it's familiar. It's another instance where Trump's preferred method, attack first, concede never, runs headlong into something immune to pressure. For supporters, the grounding can be framed as persecution. For skeptics, it looks like accountability. But for undecided voters, it registers differently. It looks messy. It looks exhausting. It looks like yet another avoidable conflict born from refusal to do the boring work required of leadership. And fatigue, more than outrage, is what shifts elections. This is why the episode matters, even if it resolves quietly, even if the plane is cleared tomorrow. Because the memory will remain. There was a moment when Trump's campaign momentum stalled, not because of an opponent, not because of a scandal, but because of a rule he didn't want to follow. That story sticks precisely because it's simple. In the end, the FAA won't claim victory. Trump won't admit defeat. The plane will eventually fly again, and the news cycle will move on. But something subtle will have changed. A reminder will have been lodged in the public consciousness. There are still systems that don't negotiate, don't posture, and don't care who you are. And for a candidate whose entire appeal rests on the idea that he can overpower systems, even a brief pause on the runway carries weight. Because once people see that you can be stopped, really stopped, the myth of unstoppable motion becomes harder to sell. The engines will roar again someday, but the echo of this moment will linger long after the jet leaves the ground. What follows after that kind of pause is rarely loud, but it's decisive. Campaigns don't collapse all at once. They fray. Small adjustments accumulate. Schedules get tighter. Margins for error shrink. Staffers become cautious where they were once aggressive, and the candidate, especially one who thrives on momentum, starts reacting instead of dictating. That shift is subtle, but it's visible to the people who matter most: donors, party insiders, and undecided voters watching for signals of competence under pressure. There's also a psychological dimension that's easy to miss. Trump has always framed himself as the man who bends institutions to his will. Courts, media, regulators, he challenges them all, loudly, relentlessly. But every so often he runs into a system that doesn't escalate, doesn't respond emotionally, and doesn't flinch. When that happens, his usual tactics lose their effect. Anger has nothing to attach to. Accusations bounce off procedure, and the absence of a visible enemy drains energy from the fight. For the FAA, this isn't personal. That's precisely why it's effective. There's no villain for Trump to personify, no single official to demonize into submission. It's a bureaucracy doing exactly what it was designed to do: enforce standards quietly and uniformly. And that design exists for one reason, to ensure that when something goes wrong in the air, politics isn't part of the explanation. Meanwhile, the broader political ecosystem is absorbing the lesson. Other agencies are watching. So are state officials, regulators, and institutional actors who have spent years being attacked from the outside. They're seeing proof that calm, documented enforcement can withstand pressure that theatrics can't overwhelm. That realization doesn't just apply to aviation, it applies to governance. The jet itself almost becomes secondary. What matters is the signal. Resistance doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like waiting, waiting for compliance, waiting for paperwork, waiting for the rules to be followed. And in that waiting, power quietly shifts away from the person demanding exceptions. Trump's campaign will move forward. It always does. He'll find ways around obstacles. He'll adapt messaging. He'll reframe the story. But this episode will sit beneath all of that as a reminder that some limits aren't imposed by opponents. They're imposed by reality. And reality doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how loudly you insist you're right. In politics, perception is everything, and the perception forming here isn't about aviation law, it's about friction, about whether Trump smooths over problems or creates them, about whether leadership means bending rules or mastering them. Those impressions settle slowly, but once they do, they're hard to dislodge. So when the plane finally lifts off again, whenever that happens, it won't erase what came before. The runway delay will already have done its work. A campaign that sells inevitability just learned that inevitability can be interrupted. And once voters see interruption, they start imagining alternatives. That's how moments like this end. Not with a crash, not with a bang, but with a recalibration. Quiet, procedural, and deeply consequential.